Hi everyone, I'm Krista Nonamaker, and today I want to talk to you a little bit about the Meiji Restoration, which took place in Japan from about the period of 1868 to 1889. So we're looking at approximately a period of 20 years. So let's take a quick look at a timeline of what happened during this restoration. And the word restoration means something is restored. In this case, the restoration was the restoration of the emperor to the throne. But it would be a different kind of imperial government than prior to what was in place, which was a shogunate. So let's start with 1868 as the end of the Tokugawa shogunate. And we'll talk a little bit more about this, but basically two factions were battling one another, and the one in favor of imperial control won. In 1872, we see that national education is introduced. So that's across the country. In 1873, samurai privileges are removed. In 1877, there was a successful resistance against the Satsuma Rebellion. In 1879, a local system of representative government was introduced. In 1884, the upper house, that is the House of Peers, a legislative body was created. In 1885, a cabinet was created, and in 1889, a constitution was adopted, created by bicameral legislature, the Diet. So in essence, what we see at the end of this period is a constitutional monarchy. So these are just markers, bookmarks, if you will, for the period of time that are sort of good to know. But understanding how this happened and why is the real purpose here. So the end of the shogunate, the Tokugawa shogunate, a coup d'etat took place, which restored imperial rule and it replaced the shogun with the emperor. However, there was sporadic fighting following into 1869 until something called the Charter Oath was signed, which made the government respect public opinion and work towards good relations with other countries. This was an interesting thing because the government was trying to work as a cohesive body. Edo was also renamed Tokyo and became the nation's capital. One of the first things that those in favor of the imperial restoration was the recognition that they had been too insular, that they had been not looking at what was going on around the rest of the world. So one of the things they did was to send 250 students to study abroad in Europe. And foreign instructors were also brought to Japan. Americans taught large-scale farming and the natural and social sciences, and the Germans taught medicine, just as some examples. They studied how Western governments were designed, in fact. Also, as we mentioned, some students went overseas, and here's a picture of two students studying in Heidelberg, Germany. So about the creation of the new structure of government, this bicameral legislature, which was created in 1889, the House of Peers was the upper house, and only the nobility could vote for those people. There was then a House of Representatives, a lower house established. Again, only 1% of population and only males could vote, so it was restricted democracy, but it was a step in the right direction. The emperor was still in place, and thus a constitutional monarchy, that chap and H, was put into place. It was the first parliamentary form of government in Asia. A new army was created based on the German model. The new navy was created based on the British model. So what we see here is a real reliance on outside developments, which is not a bad thing, but it's worthy of note. Economically, in the 80s, agriculture increased by 30%, and that's probably just as a direct relationship to the fact that there was large-scale farming that was shared with them by Americans. And then it increased by 100% between 1890 and 1915. Most of the agricultural surplus went to export. However, the poorer people in the country, the peasants, were still poor. They didn't get to see the profits, and they were often squeezed off of land. And this is why they went places like the United States or Latin America to try and have a better life, because they weren't finding it in Japan. In other ways, the country also tried to build up their infrastructure. For example, the government built their first railroad in 1872 between Tokyo and Yokohama, And by connecting all these places, that increased economic trade. The government financed coal mines, iron mines, tool factories, cotton and wool factories, shipyards, and so much more. Having the money behind these kinds of things enabled them to increase their production. All in all, though, silk was one of the major major products of, and so that accounted for 40% of Japanese exports. This is a picture actually of women working with silk. In terms of culture and education, Japan adopted the Gregorian calendar and the 7-day work week in 1882. The metric system was adopted in 1886. Western dress was mandated in 1872. Western literature became very popular. As a result of the national education standards, by 1905, over 90% of the population was literate, and they established universities, starting with Tokyo University in 1886. All of these helped to build their country into a very powerful one, which in 1894 showed how powerful they were when basically they were able to defeat China in the Japanese-Sino War, and it showed how weak China had become. Japan looked towards the West, looked towards industrialization, and made these changes. But what lessons do we learn from the Meiji Restoration, a 20-year period? Well, we see the power of collective goals. When there's a desire for change and it is the focus of their efforts, you can see great change will happen. Also, they were willing and open to learning from others. So they looked to Western Europe and took what they felt was appropriate for Japan. They did not do well in helping the poor, the peasants, and women. Those groups tended to be left behind. And so in history, we learn that we need to look at all the different groups. And we also realize that there is the power of change. And sometimes the change means that you have conflict, but that change can be successful and it will help in the long run. So hopefully you understand a little bit more about the Meiji Restoration and find it as interesting as I did.